Well, slowly but surely, and in recent days, a bit quicker, the truth is coming to light about Tony Blair and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I wrote a book in 2003 called Tales from the Time Loop, which set out the scam, the manipulation, and the sequence that led to the lie and lies that produced the manufactured excuse to invade Iraq. And what's coming to light bit by bit is confirming that sequence. First of all, we've had a memo come into the public arena written by Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State in the US in the run-up and during the invasion of Iraq. And they call him Colin, but his name's spelled Colin. I can only surmise that they call him Colin because he's full of shit, because that is what came to be obvious when he was doing a presentation to the United Nations in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, selling the blatant lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction which he was going to unleash on the world. And this memo confirmed, and it was written in late March 2002, it confirmed that Tony Blair, British Prime Minister, was on board and supporting the American plans for the invasion of Iraq. That is late March 2002. And right up to the invasion in the spring of 2003, Tony Blair was still lying through his bloody teeth to the British Parliament and the British people, saying that even at this late stage in the run-up to the invasion, it could still be avoided if Saddam gave up his weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist. So we'll look at what he said, Mr. Liar, and genetically so. This is a speech or a statement to the House of Commons on February the 25th, 2003, very close to the invasion. And he said, "I detest his, Saddam's, regime. But even now, he, Saddam, can save it by complying with the UN's demand. Even now, we are prepared to go the extra step to achieve disarmament peacefully. I do not want war." Breathe, Dave, breathe. "But disarmament peacefully can only happen with Saddam's active cooperation." The truth? They knew those weapons of mass destruction didn't exist, but they needed an excuse to go to war as part of picking off regime after regime and country after country in the Middle East, which has gone on ever since. Something else that we now know is covered in this story: burn it, destroy it. And this is the fact that in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, Tony Blair's Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, said that the invasion was likely to be challenged under international law as illegal, which would make the people taking part war criminals. And when that advice was presented, someone in the Blair government circle, according to this story, ordered that that advice be burned and destroyed so no one saw it. And what then happened is that the pressure was applied mercilessly, probably, upon this Lord Goldsmith bloke to change his advice, and he did, and actually gave the advice that the invasion was actually legal. And all this manipulation is going on for reasons I'll come to in a second, because Iraq was simply one country in a list of countries being targeted for regime change by this global cabal that I've been exposing for a quarter of a century. And they needed excuses to do it. So weapons of mass destruction, even though it was a lie, was the excuse they chose. So this Burnett story, this is what the story says. The burning row relates to the 13-page legal opinion presented by Lord Goldsmith to Blair on March the 7th, 2003, less than 3 weeks before the outbreak of war. The opinion, details of which were exclusively revealed by the Mail on Sunday in 2005, stated that the war was likely to be challenged under international law because of the lack of backing from the United Nations. The advice was never released and was kept secret from most of the cabinet because, governments are completely compartmentalized. Most of the people in the cabinet of a government don't have a clue what's bloody going on. Only a few powerful aides of Blair, such as number 10 Director of Communications Alistair Campbell, were allowed to see it. A senior number 10 figure at the time told the Mail on Sunday last night there was pandemonium. The date when war was expected to start was already in the diary. Well, it had been for bloody years, if not to the day. And here was Goldsmith saying it could be challenged under international law. They said, burn it, destroy it, and got to work on the Attorney General. Yeah, to change his bloody mind and give them the advice they wanted. Lord Goldsmith's one-page legal opinion, produced 10 days later, and 3 days before war broke out, stripped out all his previous reservations and declared the war to be legal. This version was discussed in Cabinet and cited in Parliament to justify military invasion. So, how do the pieces fit? Well, a series of countries that this global cabal working through Britain and the United States, that they wanted to overthrow and regime change and take over, goes back years. And Iraq was just one of them. And the first public sight of this list came in September 2000 when an organization called the Project for the New American Century, neoconservatives or neocons as they were called, produced this document listing a series of countries for regime change, and regime change as a result of what they called multiple theater wars fought by the United States, either covertly or overtly through the Arab Spring. And these countries included Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, and they needed excuses to invade them, to regime change them. The people involved with the Project for the New American Century included Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, who then became Defense Secretary and Deputy Defense Secretary running the Pentagon, few months later when the Bush administration came to light. Another person involved with the Project for the New American Century was Dick Cheney, who a few months later became Vice President of the United States and, in truth, President, in fact, while Boy George Bush was reading his bloody comics or something. The document also said that this process of transformation that he called it, this series of country takeovers, would be necessarily slow, absent some catalyzing and catastrophic event, like a new Pearl Harbor. These characters came to power in the Bush administration a few months later, and soon after that, in the same year, in fact 1 year to the same month that this document was published, the United States had 9/11. And Bush called it our Pearl Harbor. As a result of that terrorist attack, which was an inside job, that's why none of the pieces make any bloody sense and none of the official story makes any sense. As a result of 9/11, they had the excuse to start the war on terror. And the war on terror led eventually to the excuse to invade Iraq. And because they didn't have an excuse, they made one up. Weapons of mass destruction. It's the sequence or the technique that I call problem, reaction, solution. You create a problem covertly, you tell the people that they're in danger because of the problem and you want a reaction from the people, do something. And so after you've created the problem, got the reaction, do something, you then offer the solutions to the problems you created, which is to do what you intended to do all along, but couldn't do or justify without the manufactured problem. Now there's another version of that I call no problem, reaction, solution. You don't need a real problem, you just need to invent one and get the public perception that there's a problem, i.e. weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And so the invasion of Iraq was always going to happen, and all the bullshit about, oh no, it could still be stopped, was all lies. And so when Lord Goldsmith came along and said, actually this could be illegal, of course, burn it, destroy it, because it was a danger to the plan of invading Iraq. Then there's another thing. Dr. David Kelly. David Kelly was a weapons inspector with great experience of Iraq. And he knew that what Blair and his spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, in cohorts with British intelligence were telling the British people about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was simply not true. And these people produced a dossier, oh, say, be very afraid. Oh, we better invade then, yeah, better be afraid. And what happened is that David Kelly, who no one really had ever heard of, in the public arena anyway, talked to a BBC journalist called Andrew Gilligan and told him that this dossier had been sexed up. In other words, it was full of bloody lies to justify the war. Now this was very, very dangerous to the credibility of the invasion. I mean, here was a weapons inspector of enormous experience in Iraq saying, actually, they're lying, in effect. And what then happened was that he was outed, was subject to enormous public attention, outed as the person who was behind Gilligan's source for the dossier being sexed up. And soon afterwards, he left home and went for a walk from which he never returned, because he went into the woods and committed suicide. And the official story of his suicide is so ludicrous, so ridiculous, so incredible, it takes the breath away. What I'm going to do in this video cast is go through the detail of these different elements. But for this, opening, if you like, I'm going to just connect the dots of how the background went on. So, as I'll talk about in detail, Kelly was murdered by the state. So then they had an inquiry into what happened to David Kelly, which was instigated by Blair and his former bloody housemate, flatmate, Lord Falconer, the top law officer of the time, the Lord Chancellor. And they appointed this guy, Lord Hutton, a real establishment bloke, to oversee the inquiry into what happened to David Kelly, who died so, shall we say, conveniently for the agenda. And the Hutton inquiry, I can only repeat, was so ludicrous, so ridiculous, so incredible, in the sense that its outcome was clearly decided before any evidence was given. This is why Lord Hutton has been known to this day as Lord Whitewash. So then we had the start of an inquiry in 2009 by a guy called Sir John Chilcot, inquiring into the background to going to war with Iraq. It was supposed to take a year. It's still not reported, and says that it might do in the summer of 2016. And it's gone on and on and on and on, all to the benefit of Tony Blair. While the present Prime Minister, David Cameron, says, oh, it's terrible how long it's taken. He could push it on if he wanted. But of course, Blair and Cameron are controlled by the same force, the same cabal. That's why they watch each other's backs, even though they're in different parties. Don't make any difference at all. And John Chilcot is a friend of Blair. Blair arranged for him to get his knighthood. And yet he is overseeing an inquiry into Blair's conduct into the run-up to the Iraq invasion. This is why, as it was widely noted, when Blair appeared before the Chilcot inquiry, he was given the easiest of easiest rides. It's all a frickin' cover-up. What happened? It was decided that these countries, which are still being picked off, Syria, Libya, were going to be regime changed. They needed excuses. They decided on weapons of mass destruction. The agreement between Blair and Bush was at least a year before. Those in the shadows had decided years before this was going to happen. Goldsmith could have thrown a spanner in the works. They sorted him out. David Kelly was throwing a spanner in the works. The state sorted him out, which is why his suicide makes no sense, as I'll go into in detail in this videocast. Chilcot is there to stop the real truth coming out, the kind of stuff that I've just been talking about. And Hutton was there to stop the real truth about David Kelly coming out. And that's the truth about what all this is about. But one day, as the holes in the dike keep springing leaks, we can only hope that war criminal Tony Blair will end up where he should have been all along, with bars in front of his eyes. Now, let's start looking at some of the detail. This whole David Kelly story is extraordinary in the sense that he is supposed to have committed suicide in the woods after going for a walk amid this furore about him saying that the Iraq dossier had been sexed up. But the story of his suicide is so utterly insane when put in context to the evidence. Now, there's an MP, he was a member of Parliament until actually this year, when he lost his seat, a guy called Norman Baker. And he started to seriously doubt, quite rightly, that Kelly had been a suicide. And this is a story headed, "Why I Know Weapons Expert Dr. David Kelly Was Murdered by the MP who spent a year investigating his death. He produced a book, actually, Norman Baker, about it. So David Kelly was the UK's leading weapons inspector. And as the story says, his life ended in the cold, lonely wood where he was found the next morning after going out for his walk, which he did regularly, so people would have known where he would go. His left wrist was cut open, more about that in a minute, and 3 nearly empty blister packs of painkillers were in his jacket pocket, more of that too. His death was, of course, sensational front page news. Dr. Kelly, unknown to almost everybody at the beginning of that July, this is 2003, had in recent days barely been absent from media headlines as a result of this great furore. Much to his chagrin, he had been thrust into the harsh glare of publicity, accused of being the mole who expressed to the BBC deep concern about the government's sexing up of its dossier on weapons of mass destruction. For Blair, accused of misusing, exaggerating, or even inventing intelligence in order to justify the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the stakes could not have been higher, the story says. This was undoubtedly the greatest crisis of his premiership to date. To add fuel to the flames, his director of communications, this spin doctor bloke, Alistair Campbell, had launched an unprecedented and vitriolic attack on the BBC. When you're in trouble, attack who's putting you in trouble. Turn the focus. Questioning its integrity and professionalism in the way it reported the story, like reporting the truth. Not common for the BBC, but, round of applause when it does. Suddenly, finding himself under tremendous personal pressure, it seemed that Dr. Kelly had buckled and decided to commit suicide. That was the official story. That, at least, it says here, is the official version of events, as decided by the Hutton inquiry, set up by the government with lightning speed within hours of Dr. Kelly's body being found. Why was it set up with lightning speed, this Hutton inquiry? Because otherwise an inquest would have gone ahead on how Kelly died. The inquest would have called witnesses who would have had to give evidence under oath. By immediately calling this inquiry, Hutton, establishment man, could hold the inquiry with witnesses not having to give their evidence on oath. And he overrode, indeed, those behind him, Blair and Lord Falconer, his Lord Chancellor, could override what would normally have happened in the investigation of Kelly's death. All a scam. I mean, a child could see it. Anyway, the media, the political establishment, indeed almost everyone, accepted Lord Hutton's verdict. Yeah. Did I talk about children? I'm sorry, children. I insult you by saying a child could see it, because these people couldn't. Anyway, but the more I examined it, Baker says, the more it became clear to me that Hutton's judgment was faulty and suspect in virtually all important areas, because it was a scam, it was a cover-up. I was not alone in these suspicions. Letters began to appear in the press from leading medical specialists in which they queried the suicide verdict. The letters were well argued, raising profound and disturbing questions that remain unanswered to this day. Unanswered because to answer them would be to tell the truth. It was all a lie about how he died. My investigations, he said, have since convinced me that it is nigh on clinically impossible for Dr. Kelly to have died by his own hand, and that both his personality and the other circumstantial evidence strongly mitigate against suicide. Given that his death was clearly not an accident, that leaves only one alternative, that it must have been murdered. Murdered to shut him up. After writing a newspaper article outlining my concerns, he says, I found myself on a train speeding towards Exeter to see a man who had agreed to meet me only on condition of anonymity and after some rather circuitous arrangements. These involved much complicated use of public telephone boxes to minimize the chance that his contact with me could be traced. Finally, we talked over a glass of wine in a rather nondescript club. He told me that he had recently retired but had connections both to the police and the security services, a claim which I subsequently verified through careful checks. Posing as a freelance journalist, he had attempted to contact the key policeman involved in investigating the case of Kelly. And in this he was unsuccessful, but within an hour he had received an unexpected return call. The person on the other end of the line did not bother with formalities, but instead cut to the quick. How would my contact welcome a full tax inspection of his business, VAT, national insurance, the lot? Life could be made very difficult, he was told. Did he fancy having no money? This is one way that it works, the system in silencing people. Naturally, this prospect did not appeal, and there he left matters until at a wedding he chanced upon an old friend whom he described to me initially as a very senior civil servant, but later as an agent with MI6. He told his friend of his interest in the Kelly affair and also of the threatening police call he received, or phone call, not police call, that he received. His friend's reply was a serious one. He should be careful, particularly when using his phone or his computer. Moreover, he should let the Kelly matter drop. But my contact did not do so. 2 weeks later he met his friend again, this time in a pub, and pressed him on the matter. His friend took him outside, and as they stood in the cool air, told him Dr. Kelly's death had been a wet operation, a wet disposal. He also warned him in very strong terms to leave the matter well alone. This time he decided to heed the warning. Essentially, it seems that a wet operation or a wet disposal refers to an assassination, perhaps carried out in a hurry, exactly what happened to Kelly. A few months later, I called my contact to check one or two points of his story. He told me that 3 weeks after our meeting in Exeter, his house had been broken into and his laptop containing all his material on Kelly had been stolen. Other valuable goods, including a camera and an LCD television, had all been left untouched. It was sobering to be given such a clear indication that Dr. Kelly had been murdered, but the scientist himself appears to have been fully aware that his work made him a target for assassins. A British diplomat, David Broucher, told the Hutton inquiry that some 6 months or some months before Dr. Kelly's death, he had asked him what would happen if Iraq were invaded. Rather chillingly, Dr. Kelly replied that he would probably be found dead in the woods. Nobody can seriously suggest, Baker says, that he was suicidal at the time the meeting took place, yet Lord Hutton seems to have made his mind up, was told to make his mind up, about the way in which Dr. Kelly died before the inquiry even began. Exactly, that's why they had the inquiry, to override the inquest. The result is a series of gaping, unresolved anomalies. Why anomalies? Because it's all a lie. Crucially in his report, Hutton declared that the principal cause of death was bleeding from a self-inflicted knife wound on Dr. Kelly's left wrist. Yet Dr. Nicholas Hunt, the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination on Dr. Kelly, stated that he had cut only one blood vessel, the ulnar artery. Since the arteries in the wrist are of matchstick thickness, severing just one of them does not lead to life-threatening blood loss, because what Kelly is officially supposed to have done is died through suicide by cutting his wrists and running out of blood, and by taking sort of 20-odd painkillers. It says here, especially if it is cut crossways, the method apparently adopted by Dr. Kelly, rather than going along the length, it's even more next to impossible to kill yourself through blood loss. The artery simply retracts and stops bleeding, which makes sense of what I'm going to come to. Given that the average human body contains 10 pints of blood and that half of these must be lost before death ensues, we must also ask ourselves why there were clear signs at the post-mortem that Dr. Kelly had retained much of his blood. There were clear signs at the scene as well. More significant still, while the effects of 5 pints of blood spurting from the body could not easily be hidden, the members of the search party who found his body did not even notice that Dr. Kelly had apparently incised his wrist with a knife. There were no blood, just odd specks which came from whoever killed him, staging the cut wrist. Bit of blood comes out. Oh, he killed himself, lost 5 pints of blood. Well, where is it? Their arrival of the search party was followed by that of paramedics who pointedly referred to the fact that there was remarkably little blood around the body. If the idea that blood loss brought about Dr. David Kelly's death is flawed, still less plausible is the suggestion that he chose to overdose to quicken his end. My Pedersen, a close friend of Dr. Kelly's, has confirmed that he hated all types of tablets and had an aversion even to swallowing a headache pill. Yet we are told that he removed from his house 3 blister packs, each containing 10 of the coproximol painkillers, which his wife Janice took for her arthritis. Each of these oval pills was about half an inch long. Since there was only 1 tablet left, the implication is that he had swallowed 29 of them. If this is right, we are being asked to believe that Dr. Kelly indulged in a further masochistic act in an attempt to take his life. A further objection is that the police evidence states that there was half a litre bottle of Evian water, or half a litre bottle of Evian water by the body, which had not been fully drunk. Common sense, Baker says, tells us that quite a lot of water would be required to swallow 29 large tablets. It frankly is so unlikely, with only a small bottle of water to hand, that any would have been left undrunk. He didn't drink any of it, did he? Stranger still, tests revealed the presence of only the equivalent of a fifth of 1 pill in Dr. Kelly's stomach, forcing it down his throat to set up the alleged suicide with the cut wrist, which produced virtually no blood. I mean, talk about in a hurry. They didn't even bloody do it well, did they? Where is the media in all this? I don't know. Anyway, forensic toxicologist Alexander Allen told the Hutton Inquiry that although the levels of coproximol in Dr. Kelly's blood were higher than therapeutic levels, they were less than a third of what would normally be found in a fatal overdose. Didn't force enough down his throat, mate, did you? What are you doing? God, it's unbelievable, the nonsense that so many people will accept. As for Dr. Kelly's state of mind, in the eyes of those who knew him well, he was the last person who might be expected to take his own life. A recent convert to the Baha'i faith, which expressly forbids suicide, he was a strong character who had survived many difficult situations in the past. His wife Janice later described him as tired, subdued, but not depressed, and the emails he sent to from his home during those hours before he went for his walk suggested his mood, if anything, was upbeat. Many thanks for your thoughts, he wrote to one colleague. It's been difficult. Hopefully we'll all blow over by the end of the week and I can travel to Baghdad and get on with the real work of weapons inspecting. Indeed, so keen was Dr. Kelly to get back to Iraq that he spoke to Wing Commander John Clark at the Ministry of Defence about when he could return. Yeah, this guy's just about to go and kill himself. A trip was booked for him the following Friday, and his diary, recovered by the police, shows that the trip had been entered for the day. People about to kill themselves do not generally first book airline tickets for a flight they have no intention of taking. Well, they do in official stories, because anything goes in them. Since none of this fits the profile of a man about to commit suicide, we are faced with an obvious question. If Dr. Kelly did not kill himself, then who might have been responsible for his death? The British state, to silence him so he couldn't expose the lies that justified the invasion of Iraq on the list of countries that are still being picked off. Quite simply, it would qualify as an astonishing coincidence if his death were not rooted in the furore over Iraq. You ain't bloody kidding. At this point, it has to be asked whether there were elements in the British intelligence services, or indeed within Number 10 Downing Street itself, that would have wanted Kelly dead. A question that needs no answer. Then there's the paramedics. Dr. David Kelly's body had obviously been moved. Paramedic at death scene reveals concerns over Hutton inquiry. The paramedic who confirmed the death of government scientist Dr. David Kelly has claimed his body had obviously been moved in the minutes after it was found. David Bartlett was one of the two medics called after the corpse of the weapons inspector was discovered in the woods near Oxfordshire. They were among the first at the scene. The testimony by the experienced paramedics once again brings into doubt the thoroughness of the Hutton inquiry. It wasn't even thorough at all. It never started even to be thorough. It wasn't meant to be thorough. In particular, raising questions about why police officers were not asked whether they had touched or moved the body. Well, they might have had to say they did, and that would have pushed some dominoes down. So I ain't going to ask them that, are they? In his interview, 59-year-old paramedic Mr. Bartlett discloses further series of irregularities about that day's events, putting yet more pressure on the government to agree to a full inquest into the scientist's death, which they never have. And the Conservative government that followed the Labour government of Tony Blair never has, because they're all in it together, really, in terms of the same masters. Like many of the witnesses expressing doubts about the Kelly case, Oxfordshire-born Mr. Bartlett is far from a conspiracy theorist. Well, you can't be a conspiracy theorist because then you absolutely have no credibility. But he's not. He's just talking about facts. A father of three, he had been a dedicated paramedic for 24 years. His testimony, the first time he has talked in such detail, is crucial, as the civilian volunteer searchers who first found the body said it was leaning against a tree. He said if earlier witnesses said that, then the body had obviously been moved, and loads of them did say that by the time we got there. Mr. Bartlett backs up claims by DC policeman Graham Coe, the first policeman on the scene, about how little blood there was around the body. Guy bled to death, right? The paramedic said, "I've seen more blood at a nosebleed than I saw there." However, the Hutton inquiry said that Dr. Kelly had bled to death after cutting a small artery in his wrist. Mr. Bartlett also said that after the body was found, the police threw a blackout around the scene, even banning him from speaking to his control room by radio. He says this is the only time it has happened in his long career. The paramedic also reveals that a year after the death, he was approached by a stranger in Oxford who said he was a close friend of Dr. Kelly. The man said he recognized Mr. Bartlett from media coverage. Mr. Bartlett said, "He said to me he'd known David Kelly since he was a boy. There was nothing to doubt about him. He told me about Dr. Kelly and he'd been a member of the Baha'i faith and that suicide was against their religion. He said, I'm telling you now, there's no way in the world that guy committed suicide." The paramedic gave evidence to the Hutton inquiry, but said, "I thought they'd already decided the outcome and wanted someone to confirm it for them. They'd decided it was going to be suicide, and that was all cut and dried. I wasn't impressed with how it was conducted. It should have been under oath. The photographs of the scene should have been released, but they weren't. And they shouldn't have sealed the documents for 70 years. Yeah. Here is a weapons inspector who's been killed, or who's died, apparently by suicide, so there's nothing to hide because it's true, right? And this Lord Hutton ruled that medical records, including the post-mortem on David Kelly, should be sealed and not made public for 70 years. I mean, elephants in the frickin' living room. Another thing is this. Kelly, vital report is lost. The controversy over the death of government scientist Dr. David Kelly has deepened after ambulance chiefs admitted that a vital medical record relating to the case has vanished. Amazing, these miracles that take place when the cover stories are being spouted. The South Central Ambulance NHS Trust has lost the patient report form, PRF, completed by paramedic Vanessa Hunt, who attended the scene of the former weapons inspector's death in 2003. Vanessa Hunt was the working partner on the ambulance team of Bartlett. The disclosure will inevitably fuel demands for a full inquest into his death. See earlier, it ain't happened. A leading coroner yesterday said, for people around the world who maybe not have the same language, a coroner is the person that would have conducted the inquest and had witnesses under oath. A leading coroner yesterday said that the form is one of the key documents at an inquest, as it provides a record of any incident as recorded at the time. Ambulance crews called upon to give evidence would normally rely only on the information contained in the document. Dr. Michael Powers QC, who is leading a group of doctors campaigning for an inquest into Dr. Kelly's death, described the loss of the paperwork as quite frankly astonishing. He said, "The fact that such an important document has gone missing simply strengthens the case for an inquest. It was clear to everyone at the time that Dr. Kelly's death was a very significant event, and the value of all contemporaneous documents should have been recognized. All documents should have been carefully copied. However, the Trust says that it can't find either the original document or a copy scanned into its computer system, even though it has a policy of storing such documents for 10 years. How much more evidence do people need that Kelly was murdered by the state so he couldn't expose the lies about the Iraq invasion? So, here we have another story. Let's go on to the Chilcot inquiry from Sir John Chilcot, Blair's mate, who is supposed to be investigating the circumstances leading up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It started its work in 2009, should have taken a year, they said, and now it's not going to report at least until the summer of 2016. This story says, revealed the very cosy relationship between Iraq inquiry chief and Tony Blair, who knighted him after private meeting in London club. When former Prime Minister Tony Blair first appeared before the Iraq inquiry to give evidence, the chairman, Sir John Chilcot, treated him with almost painful deference. Chilcot, a crumpled figure whose opening remarks lasted 7 minutes, never laid a glove on Blair, even though the former Prime Minister gave evidence for more than 6 hours. What few people know is that the bumbling Chilcot, a retired career civil servant, could in fact have greeted Blair as an old friend. For the first time they met in 1997, when Blair was still leader of the opposition Labour Party. It was in a far more sedate environment. They dined together in the venerable Travellers Club in Pall Mall. That must have cost a few quid, on the taxpayer, no doubt, where Chilcot is a member. The meeting was so discreet it would have remained a secret but for a single sentence in a 2008 book by Blair's former Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, called Great Hatred, Little Room, Making Peace in Northern Ireland. At the time of the meeting, John Chilcot was the most senior civil servant at the Northern Ireland office. He had agreed to the clandestine encounter with Blair almost 5 months before the Labour leader became Prime Minister. After Blair became Prime Minister, he worked closely with Chilcot on the Northern Ireland peace process until the Mandarin took early retirement at the end of 1997. Chilcot was then knighted by a grateful Blair into the Order of the Bath. Strange people. the fourth most senior order of British chivalry. Chivalry about genuineness, integrity. Maybe my dictionary is wrong. But after he retired from the civil service, Chilcot never really left the corridors of power. He has now worked in Whitehall for 50 years, taking on a series of roles on any number of public committees, often at the behest of the Blair administration. And what has happened is that this Chilcot inquiry, to the benefit of Blair, has gone on and on and on and on. One of the things that Chilcot claims has been holding it up is that he's been blocked from having access to communications between Blair and Bush about the invasion. This Colon Powell memo that's come to light confirms what would have been in those communications. You're right to invade Iraq? Oh yes, Georgie. Yeah, yes, sure. And this is a story about the man who is said to have been responsible for blocking access by the Chilcot inquiry, which, incidentally, as well as Chilcot, includes people who supported the invasion of Iraq at the time. The man who blocked the Chilcot inquiry from having access to these communications, and thus Chilcot's excuse has slowed down the procedure, is a guy called Haywood, Sir Jeremy Haywood. And this is the headline in a story about him, Sir Cover-Up. He's become known as Sir Cover-Up for blocking these communications being made public. Sir Cover-Up under fire for his delaying tactics. Now let's have a look about this. The role played by the country's top civil servant in delaying the Iraq inquiry was in the spotlight last night. Now, as I'll come to, this bloke, Haywood, Sir Jeremy Haywood, he's cabinet secretary to the present Prime Minister, David Cameron, Conservative Party, and worked for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister in the period of the Iraq invasion run-up. And Blair was Labour Party. These two parties are supposed to be in opposition, and here's this guy Haywood working for both of them. Why? Because they just massacred on the same face. Anyway, Sir John Chilcot complained his inquiry was being stalled because the Cabinet Secretary, Haywood, was seeking to block the release of correspondence between Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, who followed Blair as Prime Minister of the Labour Party, and George W. Bush. Sir John had requested the declassification of 130 records of conversations, around 30 notes and papers from 200 cabinet-level discussions. An agreement was finally struck last year, but some of the content of the communications will be edited out when the report is published. I bet it will. Critics question whether Sir Jeremy was the right arbiter since he was Principal Private Secretary. You couldn't make it up. Principal Private Secretary to Blair in Downing Street from 1999 to 2003, at the time when decisions were made to go to war. In the Hutton inquiry, which was held into the death of David Kelly, it emerged that in a breach of Whitehall procedures, Sir Jeremy Haywood had not had minutes taken of 4 meetings involving ministers and senior officials that had taken place in the 48 hours before the weapons expert's name was released to the public, which started the sequence of events which eventually led to his death. Nicknamed Sir Cover-Up for preventing the inquiry from seeing the Blair-Bush material, Sir Jeremy's influence is such that Mr. Cameron, present Prime Minister, is said to have once joked, "Remind me, Jeremy, do you work for me or do I work for you?" Also in this this story about Hayworth and blocking the communications coming to light, is a little section looking at some of the players in this whole deal. Tony Blair, obviously, Alistair Campbell, the spin doctor, who was selling this garbage, these lies to the public, and a guy called Sir John Scarlett, we'll come to, he's an intelligence bloke. Here we go. Tony Blair, Prime Minister, 1997 to 2007. The charge: wildly exaggerated evidence that Saddam posed a deadly threat to Britain, while suppressing advice that war might be illegal, duped the cabinet, Parliament and public into backing an invasion he had already agreed privately with George Bush, having assured the president in 2002 that if Saddam had to be toppled militarily, Britain would be there. Excuse me. Where is Blair now? Has amassed vast personal wealth, estimated at between 20 million and 100 million, through speeches and the consultancy firm Tony Blair Associates, being paid for services rendered, whose clients include some of the world's most notorious despots. Well, he must feel at bloody home then. Then there's Alistair Campbell, always at his shoulder, the spinner of information to manipulate public opinion. Alistair Campbell, Blair's spin doctor and Director of Communications, 1997 to 2003. Charge: pivotal role in making the case for war, including the production of the so-called dodgy dossier, which I mentioned earlier, in February 2003. The gravest charge is that he influenced Parliament's Joint Intelligence Committee and beefed up unfounded claims that Saddam could fire weapons of mass destruction in 45 minutes. Where is Campbell now? Has enjoyed a lucrative career as an author and TV pundit. Sir John Scarlett, Chairman, Cabinet Office Joint Intelligence Committee, 2001-2004. Charge: described by Campbell as a mate, he is accused of allowing the Prime Minister and his spin doctor to influence the content of the key intelligence reports that led to the war. Where now? Blair named Sir John Scarlett head of MI6 in 2004. Cheers, John. Said I'd give you a reward for it. Seen by many, it says here, seen by many as a reward for his role in the build-up to the Iraq invasion. He was knighted in 2007. After stepping down from MI6 in 2009, he joined the board of Times newspapers. I'm sure they'll tell the bloody truth. And, you know, I mentioned earlier about David Cameron and how it all connects and how they are answering to the same masters, therefore they're watching each other's backs. There aren't many people that I would call journalists in the mainstream media, but one is called Peter Oborne. I like this guy. He's prepared to say it like it is, and he's done some really good stuff over the years. And he says here in one of his articles, see, what Cameron is doing, he's on the one hand saying the Chilcot inquiry it's terrible that it's taking so long, but actually he wants it to take that long for the reasons I've described. And this article by Oborne is headed Chilcot and Whitehall's Dark Arts. David Cameron last week expressed his deep frustration about the long delay to the publication of the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. These protestations from the Prime Minister are pure hypocrisy. Well, he does that, you know, by reflex action. The truth is that Chilcot could have been published years ago had Mr. Cameron wanted. Exactly. Though Sir John Chilcot certainly deserves his share of the blame for the late arrival, much of the responsibility lies with Whitehall procrastination orchestrated by the Cabinet Secretary Jeremy Haywood, otherwise known as the cover-up. Haywood has denied this, saying it frustrates me that I'm being accused of trying to get in the way or covering things up, because that is just absolutely not the way in which I've approached it. It's the way in which he's approached it. More worryingly, Oborne says, as Richard Norton Taylor, respected defence and security writer for The Guardian, revealed last week, some blockages seem very sinister indeed and could be seen to amount to sabotage. Norton Taylor revealed that Whitehall, code for very senior civil servants and intelligence bosses, failed to hand Chilcot all the information he needed. They kept a tight hold on vital material explaining the decision to wage war, which they said then showed to those criticised, which was then showed to those criticised in the first draft of the report. This meant those individuals, including Blair, could challenge Chilcot's conclusions using documents which he was unaware of. Cameron could and should have put a stop to this cynical act of establishment sabotage. He failed to do so. The Prime Minister can bleat as much as he likes about the late report. It would have arrived much sooner had he really wanted. So, we have these people, Blair and co, particularly him, able to lie to justify an invasion that has led to untold numbers of people. Millions, if you put the dead and the maimed together. Being victims of the lie. We've had Iraq destroyed, and we've had the catastrophe coming out of that. That is known as the Middle East, which is still ongoing by the day and has led to all these migrants pouring into Europe. All this came from the lies of Tony Blair and his spin doctor Alistair Campbell and those in the shadows who were working through them. Instead of standing trial for crimes against humanity, these people have made fortunes since they ceased to be involved in government. At the same time, a man called Shaka Armour has just been released from Guantanamo Bay after 14 years being held in that fascist prison by a fascist government, having never had a charge put against him and never been put on trial. And here's a headline from this week. Shaka's joy as he hugs son he's never met after 14 years in Guantanamo Bay. You see the lad in those 3 pictures. And you see the lad with Shaka there as a child, or one of his children, not that one, as a child. And the boy was born after he was taken into Guantanamo Bay. And so he's only now seen him for the first time. And That's the world we live in, because of the forces that run it. He goes to, not even to prison, into this torture chamber called Guantanamo Bay. 14 years for doing nothing, while Blair and Campbell make their fortunes for being involved in an invasion of a country based on a lie. And here's another story. Shaka will take years to regain health after his Guantanamo ordeal. Shaka Armour is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and severe headaches, and is being tested to see if he has been poisoned, doctors revealed last night. Britain's last Guantanamo Bay detainee is receiving medical treatment at a private clinic where he is said to have had an emotional reunion with his wife, Zinara, and has seen his 4 children. Mr. Armour, who was known as Prisoner 239, don't give them names, humanises them, at the notorious US detention center in Cuba, only met his youngest son, Faris, for the first time over the weekend. Dr. David Nickel, who was the first doctor to see the 48-year-old on his return, said he had aged a lot and was suffering from severe headaches and sciatica, pain in the back, hip and leg. He looks very different to the photos in the media, Dr. David Nickel said. One thing that hasn't changed is that he has the beaming smile. He's got an amazing personality and has a fantastic sense of humour. His hair is greyer, longer, but it's the little things that strike you. He has had this red hold-all bag, the kind you'd use for going on a quick flight, and that was 14 years in one bag, which just had Prisoner 239 on it. Didn't even have his name. Even until the very end, he was just a number, not a name. Mr. Armour, who thanked the campaigners who campaigned for his release, has said that during his 14-year incarceration, without ever being charged or facing trial, he was subjected to force feeding and blood samples were taken without his consent. His lawyers said that during the time held without trial, he was subjected to torture with beatings and sleep deprivation and held in solitary confinement for 360 days. Mr. Armour says that in the early days of his captivity in Afghanistan, he was tortured in the presence of British agents. Ramzi Kazem, a law professor at the City University of New York's School of Law, who was involved in the case, said Mr. Armour was also suffering from psychological conditions. He told BBC's Radio 4 Today programme he suffers from a number of conditions, both physical and psychological, including post-traumatic stress disorder on the severe end of the spectrum. Mr. Armour's US lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith, told BBC Radio 5 Live he would sue the US for compensation, but did not expect to win because American law is pretty insane. And you know, this week, a Conservative MP called David Davis has said that Shaka Armour should not be paid compensation for 14 years in a prison for things he didn't do, because it was his choice to go to Afghanistan. He went as part of a charity. So when I talk about the world being run by psychopaths who have no empathy and no remorse, you can see from this story today in this videocast just one potent, profound example of what I mean. Before we finish, one of the outcomes of this illegal invasion of Iraq, which obviously started dominoes falling, has led to the mass migration out of the Middle East and North Africa into Europe. All, as I said in a video cast a few weeks ago, all planned. Why is it planned? Because they want to destroy European culture, so there's no sense of national identity that would lead to resisting the absorption of all the states of Europe into a centralized superstate, and which we're very close to. Although I mean, the superstate central control of the European Union is virtually there in place now. But they need to break the countries up into regions and therefore destroy national identity. That's what this is all about. And the other thing is, of course, that anything that causes chaos is good for these sick people, because chaos is so easily to manipulate. And here's a headline from this week. Backlash in the German village, population 102, that will soon be home to 750 migrants. And of course, when that happens, the culture of that village will no longer be German. And that is a microcosm of the macrocosm plan that I'm talking about. And there's a reason why Germany, of all European nations, is taking such vast, unending numbers of migrants, orchestrated by Chancellor Merkel, who is owned lock, stock and barrel by this cabal that I've been exposing all these years. The reason they picked Germany is because Germany, of all European nations, has the most fierce sense of nation, fierce sense of nationality, and therefore give them the most, because that's the nationality sense of the world that we need to break down more than any other. Once you know how the game works, the world is an open book.